needs no introduction, but I'll introduce him anyway. It's Andrew Calver, presently of Heritage Conservation Solutions. Over to you, Andy.
Good morning. There is a lot of discussion in the UK and internationally about the need to be more pragmatic about environmental conditions, particularly for loans. But today I'm going to ask you to consider a broader question. Not that we consider relaxing, as some say, accepted international standards, but that as a guiding principle, lenders should not ask borrowers for more stringent conditions than they provide themselves. So, for ethics and environmental conditions, should we preach what we practice? What I mean is that we do not ask for conditions, for example, relative humidity, that we do not maintain ourselves. Not just in our special exhibitions gallery when the humidification is actually working, but the real conditions where the objects are displayed, stored or conserved in. This is not about relaxing standards. It's just asking others to do what you can honestly demonstrate you do. If you can show that your object has spent the last 12 months in a AA climate, then you're perfectly at liberty to ask for that. But if, on the other hand, it's spent the last 3 months in an unconditioned conservation studio, unexposed facing a window, then you might want to think again. In 1994, there was a paper at the IIC Congress on Preventive Conservation by Nick Umney and David Ford from the V&A. Oh, and I think a certain Jonathan Leslie Smith contributed as well, titled, "Let's Be Honest, Realistic Environmental Parameters for Loan Objects." While it did not specifically state that we should not ask for loan conditions we did not achieve ourselves, after hearing Jonathan's presentation, I felt this would be a good principle to start with in the quest for honesty. So in the museum, my museum position since then, I've abided by this principle, that unless there are exceptional circumstances, the museum will not specify conditions that are more stringent than those where the objects are normally housed. Now, when I wrote that, I added a caveat, unless there are exceptional circumstances. And I've reconsidered the justification for that fudge factor in preparation for this talk, but let's save that for any discussion. Manchester City Art Gallery do not have the fudge factor, simply stating Manchester City galleries will not expect environmental conditions that exceed the conditions in which the items are currently displayed or stored. And while many colleagues subscribe to this view, a brief scan of UK loan policies available on the internet did not throw up any other examples, just lots of talk of pragmatism and flexibility, apart from the National Galleries, of course. I'd be keen to hear of other published policies or standards that state this as a principle. But having dealt with a large number of loans in small and large organisations over the last decade, I've come across some ludicrous specifications that I frankly do not believe the lenders maintain themselves. In terms of any benefits from this dishonesty, Jonathan's Let's Be Honest paper and the published presentation is well worth reading again. But it also appears that there are those who maintain that it's perfectly acceptable to ask for stricter standards than they maintain themselves. At a round-table debate held in the US in 2010, the plus-minus dilemma, a way forward in environmental guidelines, part of an IIC initiative, our participant, indeed an alumnus of this great university, said, "I think it is fine to require more stringent conditions for objects out on loan than one has in one's own museum. If I lend something to someone, I want them to be more careful with it than I am." Is that justifiable? Again, let's bring that up in the discussion. However, I believe that if we preach what we practice, we could actually learn a lot about our collections and their real relationship with their environment. I suggest that if we ask for reality, it will force us to look at our collections and their environment in an inquiring way, see if there are changes associated with their real environment, not what you think it should be or it might be if your funding comes through. Now, in my experience, many conservators really don't know what the conditions are where their objects are stored or displayed in, simply asking for some idealised standard or what the specification is in their special exhibitions gallery. Adopting this principle will help them find out and face reality. In preparation for this talk, I started a discussion on LinkedIn One participant suggested in Canada it was an accepted principle not to ask for stricter conditions for loans. Following this up, I received a report from a meeting of representatives of Canadian National Museums, the CCI, in 2011, which stated as part of the discussion on humidity control, when lending exhibitions or objects, the museums will not insist on better loan conditions than they can achieve in their own facilities. The UK Museums Association has recently published its Smarter Loan Guidelines. Sadly, there is no specific reference to preaching what you practice, rather to balance security and conservation requirements with the desirability of sharing collections, assess and actively manage any risk involved in a loan, understanding that the role of the lender and the borrower is to mitigate risk. Now, managing risk is still a hot topic. Indeed, Rob Waller, one of the gurus of conservation risk management, suggested that my question should be rephrased as, should museums ask for lower levels of total risk to objects for loans out than the objects are exposed to in their home setting? And as we've said, risk and value are intrinsically linked in many conservation decisions, and there may be many instances where it is beneficial to accept higher risks if the value is increased. But I'm not asking you to increase risk, just to acknowledge what your conditions really are and ask that others maintain them. To paraphrase Jonathan Ashley Smith, I want you to manage the change in the object in the same way as I do. I think it is ethically wrong to ask for more stringent conditions than we meet ourselves, and it could move things forward if this was a published guiding principle for as many institutions as possible. What do you think? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andy. I'm going to ask Katie Lithgow to respond to that presentation.
Yes, thanks. I'm not entirely sure why I copped this one, but thank you for it. And to be honest, my response is amazingly short, which is that I agree. Mm-hmm. You've made the case very strongly and very clearly. It seems to be perfectly commonsensical in terms of environmental conditions. I guess my only thought around it is the fact that the conservation professional does seem to be tempted to default back to the weasel number as a kind of safety net to hide behind instead of taking a professional decision which takes account of all the conditions in which something might be kept. And in fact, there's much greater risks for objects going out on loan than relative humidity and temperature fluctuations, including being dropped, crashed, lost through theft. All of these things have happened to objects that we've sent on loan, and very little, I think, has probably happened in places which have got different environmental controls. So that's really, yes, I agree.
And
is that good enough?
Do you think that your viewpoint is informed by the fact that you work for a very large landowning organisation with many historic houses, and therefore you take a more pragmatic view to environmental control?
If that's what you wanted me to say.
No, not at all. I was just wondering if that's...
Well, I think we do experience a great deal of different conditions, and I think the thinking around environmental management has moved on significantly from the numbers game to acknowledge the factors. I think the CEN guidelines say that one should be taking account of the historic conditions in which objects are kept rather than slavishly adhering to some rule book which is taken in isolation. And I would observe, I have no problem in observing that sometimes where we make interventions, if they're poor interventions, they're no better than if we left the environment perfectly alone, and that we still don't really understand how objects interact sufficiently with the environment to be completely slavish about it. But I think it is part of the duty of a professional conservator to look at the whole, the object in the round, the context in which it is, in order to make a good assessment of the risks that it can tolerate.
Okay. Thank you very much. Responses from the floor at all? Do you want to respond, Jane? We'll go to Jane first.
I really want to talk about a project in Wales called the Doll Project, where what we're looking at is lending dolls from both national and regional museums. And instead of it being about, here's the conditions that you have to meet and here's the strictures, the staff at St Fagans are training their colleagues in other museums how to look after the dolls, how to handle them and how to care for them. And I think in conservation we could try to get a little bit more on the front foot. Instead of standing there as the gatekeepers, perhaps we should be seeing us as much more as the facilitators, because if we don't want these dolls to get dropped or undressed when they're not meant to be, it's probably the skills of the people rather than the numbers on the piece of paper that will determine the real outcomes.
Do you want to respond, Andy?
Yeah, and that's a very good point. And there is a lot in various things, various loan policies, and people talking about just that, about working with other people and working with them to help them look after, to understand how the objects might react. I suppose the point I'm saying is, if we stop lying and we start to actually inquire and look at things in more detail, as Katie says, we will learn that actually our objects will survive perfectly well in a whole wide range of conditions, and that it might help us move forward into accepting more reasonable, rational, risk-aware conditions in the future.
Okay, thank you. Chris, did you want to... just wait for the mic, sorry.
Sorry, I seem to be taking this over. I would agree wholeheartedly with what you're saying, and I think it's the sensible approach. The only exception I would have or suggest is if you have an object come into your collection that is particularly significant or valuable that you cannot look after, then is it not the grown-up thing to do to pass it on to another museum that can look after it in better conditions, and so you can stipulate the conditions you would prefer to see there?
That's an interesting point, and that was something that came up in the LinkedIn discussion. Well, I don't see a problem there, because you wouldn't be... I would argue no, you shouldn't actually ask for stricter conditions than you currently keep in. But if by default they happen to have them, if there is such a thing as better conditions, then fine. I suppose there is an argument you could say that, if you're an owner and you are presenting something to somebody and there is a great belief that it needs some magical condition, then maybe you could stipulate that in some agreement, possibly.
Response at the back.
Diane Wilk from the National Museum of Wales. Just to go back to the doll project, which is rather a large part of my life at the moment, but just go back to the doll project. I think where we're going with that, what Jamie was referring to there, exemplifies many of the difficulties in this area, which is, I think that in order to move forward, there is an issue. You've got to go and should ethical change be about large leaps or small steps? How do you go? Because I think the thing that is really, having been recently involved in completely rewriting all our loans policies and, in fact, in the Smarter Loans initiative for the MA, and looking at all of these issues, the fundamental problem at the moment is that the organisation that sticks its head above the parapet and says, right, well, we're going to do this and we're going to accept all the risks that go with it, risks being ostracised by the rest of the museum world because you're not following the code of ethics. So it's which comes first, the code of ethics or the change? And I think getting that balance right is absolutely critical, because you can push and push and push, but there comes a point at which it is about risk, and it's about whether how risk averse or how or not an organisation is, and how much it wants to be prepared to be seen as a leader, which comes with risks, as opposed to a follower.
I suppose that I've probably not made it clear that I'm not asking for anyone to change any risk at all. I'm just asking for people to not ask for anything they don't do themselves.
Yeah. Got Rachel, sorry.
I'm just wondering if the focus on environment and environmental change is actually because that, in theory, is something we can control, and the risks that Katie mentioned, crashing, theft, other damage, can't be controlled. So you can't predict if the vehicle's going to crash. You can obviously make sure people adhere to the rules of the road, but I think maybe that's why there's so much focus on environment.
Katie, did you want to respond?
Well, only that one can kind of take control by picking one's transport company and specifying one's processes, like making sure that things are not left alone on the truck. I mean, of course, if people choose to ignore those sorts of guidelines, then there's nothing you can do about it. But at least you can take comfort in the fact that you have tried to control that risk.
But there's always the outside world, and you can't control that. Whereas the environment, you you've got a pretty good chance of controlling that.
Okay. Thank you very much, Andy. I'm sorry, do you want to make a quick point? Sorry, go on.
I can't make a quick point.
We'll make a slightly shorter one.
I don't think it's an ethical issue. It's to do with being whether you're stupid or whether you tell lies. So that's ethics, but it's not conservation ethics. It's about being sensible.
That was short. Thank you very much. Okay, we're going to wind that session up. Thank you very much, Andy. I'd like to thank all this morning.